didn't think I needed them. I thought that they wouldn't help. I was kind of like, my eyes are at this stage, it's not going to get any better, so we'll just leave it alone. But I would squint at my computer screen, this like forward neck position, always like squinting at it. I try to read my books, but I'd be struggling to read. And Julie, my wife, would keep telling me, you got to get in to the eye doctor. And I'd keep telling her, I don't know. Finally, I took my daughter Lyric to the eye doctor because she wanted some new contacts. And while we were there, I'm like, well, we'll just see, what happens. So I asked, do you happen to have an extra appointment? And they're like, sure, when? And I said, like, right now. And they did. They had an appointment right then. They're like, come on back. So I had an eye exam right in that moment. And it turns out I needed a stronger prescription. Not only, though, was this like not a terrible experience, I even ended up having some fun. While we were choosing my new frames, I got the whole office involved in helping me. I wanted opinions from everybody. So I'm like, hey, you over behind the desk, what do you think of these ones? They're like, I like the other ones better. And then I'm like, well, what do you think? This person over here. We got like 5 people coming out all into the room. We made Lyric at the end. She's like, we just made so many new friends getting glasses. And we did. What do you think? What do you think? And at one point, when we had finally narrowed it down to 2 pairs, we actually got the doctor to weigh in. So I asked the doctor, I'm like, doctor, come on out here. She's like, okay. And then she comes out and I said, what do you think? Do you like number 1 or do you like number 2? Number 1 or number 2? And of course, because, she's super nice, she's like, I think you should get them both. Naturally. And of course, the whole irony of the situation is that as long as I denied my need for new glasses, I remained with poor vision, right? But as soon as I admitted the reality that I couldn't see well and that I needed help, I started seeing so much better. Admitting that we cannot see, literally and metaphorically, is sometimes really tough. Just to admit, I can't see very well. I don't see this as clearly as I'd like. We just read from John chapter 9 this morning about the time when Jesus heals the man blind from birth. And there's so much in this chapter, in chapter 9, John 9, that we can't even begin to look at all of it. If you want to pull it out and look at it and kind of follow along, you can. But because there's so much there, it's so interesting. We could spend weeks and weeks talking about this chapter. But I want to focus just for this morning on the very end, like after the healing takes place. That's what I want to talk about. So the blind man receives his sight, and then he's brought to some religious leaders called Pharisees. And they have a very revealing conversation with the healed man. Now, in order to understand the conversation, we got to know who the Pharisees were. And I know a lot of us, we've been Christians a long time. We've heard lots of things about the Pharisees. But I just want to remind us who the Pharisees were, because sometimes I think actually the Pharisees get a little bit of a bad rap. And we just think, well, they're the bad ones or they're the dumb ones or whatever. We can kind of set them aside, set aside their motivations or what's maybe going on. But you got to remember the Pharisees were people who took following the Jewish law very seriously. And for them, that was a very good thing. God said, keep this law. In fact, he told them in Deuteronomy, if you do not keep this law, if you don't carefully follow all the commands and the decrees, then I will actually send you to another nation. I will send you out of this land. So God told them, follow the law super seriously. The Pharisees remembered this. They remembered actually God's people didn't follow the law. And they were exiled. They were sent to a different nation. Some of them sent to Assyria. Some of them sent to Babylon. And the Pharisees remember this. And now they're all back in Israel, but they're still not free like they used to be. They don't have their own king. In fact, they're under Roman occupation. They're still in sort of a certain kind of exile. And so the Pharisees are thinking to themselves, they're the smart, biblically smart people who think to themselves, look, if disobedience to God's law got us into this mess, well then maybe strict obedience to the law will get us out. It kind of makes sense, right? It's like, I can relate with this. If this, then this. Like, let's try to obey the law God told us to obey. These are the guys who the healed man is brought to. And verse 14 tells us why. It says it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Now, keeping the Sabbath is one of those commands. It's part of the law. It's one of the things that we got to follow, right? It's of huge importance to the Pharisees and really to the whole nation. The Pharisees want to see that we all obey God's law so that we can continue coming home from exile. Resting on Sabbath is a command, and we're trying so hard to keep it. And some of these Pharisees are worried that what Jesus did in making the mud and then smearing the mud on the man's eyes might constitute work on the Sabbath. And if it did, that's a problem, because he's not obeying the law. He's not doing what God told us to do. It's such a serious concern that in verse 16, it says some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God. He can't be from God. He can't, for he does not keep the Sabbath. He certainly can't be from God if he doesn't obey the law. But others said, well, wait a minute. How can a man who's a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. They didn't agree. They're trying to figure it out. Well, but we got to obey the law. Yeah, but look at what's going on. The Pharisees are trying to do the right thing. But the Pharisees were trying to follow the letter of their own laws, and in so doing, some of them were inadvertently missing the spirit of God's actual law. So here's what's going on a little bit. The Pharisees weren't just trying to keep the law of the Sabbath itself. They had actually created other rules that would keep folks from even getting close to breaking the Sabbath law. Things like you're only allowed to travel for a certain distance on the Sabbath. If you travel beyond that distance, then it's breaking the Sabbath. That wasn't actually part of God's law. That was a thing that was added on. They're being conscientious people. Let's not even get close to breaking the law. Or you're not allowed to plant certain things. Or you're not allowed to do things that have to do with making food, like making bread. Or you're not allowed to make all kinds of things. Don't do any making. Because if we do that, then we might be getting close to breaking the command of rest on the Sabbath. But again, in following the letter of their own rules, some of them inadvertently were missing out on the spirit of God's actual law to rest. What Jesus did in this moment is completely in keeping with God's Sabbath law. The Sabbath was designed originally to demonstrate the dignity of the human person. It was to let people rest like God rested. People will not be like beasts of burden. They will not only do servile work, they will have liberal space where they are free to demonstrate the fact that they were made in the image of God and have rest, and their dignity will be seen in this day of rest. Jesus didn't do anything to break that law. But some of the Pharisees, they missed it. They missed that Jesus was actually demonstrating the dignity of an image bearer of God. And they missed it because they were too worried about trying to focus on whether making a mud pie constituted work. They're trying to figure it out. And they missed it so badly, and this is the tragic part, that they actually condemned the good work that God did through Jesus. They missed it so much that they could actually start condemning what God was doing. Well, later on, Jesus reconnects with the healed man, and he asks him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And in verse 38, he says, Lord, I believe. And he worships him, it says. This reaction is completely different than the Pharisees' reaction. This is very interesting. The blind man, it's the complete opposite reaction. He doesn't engage in theological gymnastics to say, well, is making the mud pie, is that work? Is it not work? Or what? He doesn't do any of this. He doesn't try to judge Jesus at all. He simply receives healing, believes in Jesus, and worships him. And then in verse 39, Jesus interprets these two responses. The response from these certain Pharisees and the response from the blind man. And he says this, I came into the world that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Kind of gives a little interpretation of the moment. And some of the Pharisees overhear him. And these are smart people again, right? They're not dummies. And so they're offended. They know he's talking about them. What are you inferring, Jesus? And they ask, are we also blind? And here's the part that I want us to hear, and that we're going to talk about a little bit. Verse 41, Jesus responds, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, we see, your guilt remains. If you're like the blind man who admits his need, you get help. If you're like the Pharisees who deny their need, you don't get help, and you remain in your guilt. So here's the thing, church. We all have blind spots. Every single one of us. Do you believe that? Like even me, and do you believe even you? We all have blind spots. Every one of us is in need of instruction. We need help even to distinguish between what is really right and wrong. Between what's really good and what's actually perverse. Between what's actually beautiful and what's actually ugly. Between what's true and false. We don't always even get these things right. We need help. We need guidance. And the best guidance for figuring that stuff out comes from Jesus. None of us has got it all figured out. We are all in need of salvation. But admitting that need, admitting that I can't figure out what's right and wrong, admitting that I just thought something was so beautiful that would like be ugly to God, man, it can feel offensive because I feel like I should already know these things. Or I feel like who's somebody else to tell me that I'm wrong or whatever it did. It can feel offensive just like it did with these Pharisees, these particular Pharisees. And the sad irony of not admitting that we need help to see correctly is that we, like the Pharisees, or like me, not admitting that I need new glasses, we end up remaining in our brokenness rather than accepting God's help that would bring healing. So brothers and sisters, what I want you to know this morning is that with Jesus, it is safe to admit that we're blind. It's safe to admit we're blind with Jesus. He's a completely safe person to say, you know what, I don't have it figured out. He already knows anyway. He's not going to hurt us with the information. He wants to help us. Folks who admit that they are in need are the perfect patients for Dr. Jesus. Folks who don't admit that they are in need and won't accept his help are sadly stuck without any relief. Now, since most of us here this morning are Christians, I want to point out explicitly that this is true even for those of us who take our faith very seriously. We can be serious religious people. And I know sometimes that the word religious gets like a bad rap, but we can be people who are serious about our faith. We can be people who are serious about our relationship with Jesus. The word religious, by the way, it just means like re-ligament. It's about like re-ligamenting something, putting something back together. The word religious really means that we're reconnecting with God. God made a way for us to connect with him. It's not a bad word. Don't worry about it. If you are serious and you're treating God seriously and you're treating your faith seriously, we can still not admit our need. We can be Christians who don't admit that we need further help, and so we remain immature in our faith. For example, as Christians, we commit to following Jesus and living life his way. But we also have other commitments, right? Each one of us. We have family commitments, we have political commitments, we have relational commitments, financial commitments, other things going on in our lives. Well, I have noticed, and maybe you have too, how easy it is to conflate our Christian commitment with our other commitments. Have you noticed this? It is so easy to do, so that we actually start thinking our political commitment or our relational commitment or our financial commitment or whatever, that it's actually the same thing as our Christian commitment. We can fool ourselves this way. We can get them confused and mixed together. This is actually what the Pharisees did, whose commitment to keeping God's law, which was a good thing, became mixed with their commitment to keeping their own rules, and they couldn't tell the difference between the two. But when the Pharisees began conflating their own rules with God's, they ended up not only following unnecessary rules, like, well, bummer for you, they actually missed God's heart. They even prevented themselves from receiving the healing that could have been theirs. Well, that's just tragic, because they had confused their commitment to God with their commitment to other things. Well, you and I can do exactly the same thing. You and I can do that. I recently saw on Facebook, I just want to give you an example of how this might work. I have a friend on Facebook who happens to be a pastor, and he posted, maybe you've seen your friends doing things like this recently, he posted a medical opinion. He has a belief, and he shared it. And someone else commented, well, I disagree with your medical opinion. And then something happened that I found pretty amazing. Someone from my friend's church wanted to come to his defense. And they wrote, commenting something like this: hey, this guy who you're disagreeing with, you don't like his medical opinion, he is a pastor. He is on God's side. And so if you disagree with his medical opinion, you are disagreeing with God. Send. Now, this medical conviction had absolutely nothing to do with being on God's side or not, right? But listen to this and try to understand this. Someone had associated their Christian commitment with their medical commitment. They thought it was the same thing. As Christians, we do want our opinions about all kinds of things to be informed by our faith. We want to allow our faith to influence our parenting, and we want to allow our faith to influence the way we vote. Yes, but we also want to be aware of where we may blindly be combining our faith with other beliefs and commitments and thinking that they're the same thing when in fact they are not. Because the result of that is that quite possibly we can believe that we see when in reality we can't. But we convince ourselves as really religious people, I see because it's about God. Well, maybe it is, but maybe it's not. We have to know the difference. My friends, during the season of Lent, we're given an invitation this whole season to recognize our spiritual blindness and to turn to Jesus for sight. And our healing starts with coming to Jesus, admitting the reality that we need help. And that we're not only blind about certain things, we're also blind about our blindnesses. One of my favorite things that I heard, I love N.T. Wright. He's a New Testament Bible scholar. And one of my favorite things that he said was just in a lecture he gave. And he started his lecture. This is like one of the world's foremost New Testament scholars. And he starts his lecture by saying, I'm going to talk to you about whatever it was he was talking about. I don't remember. And he says, and I just want to give you a warning that about a third of what I'm about to tell you is wrong. And the trouble is, I don't know which third. So you're going to have to give me a little bit of grace, and you're going to have to use your own minds to try to sort it out together. We're going to think together. Sometimes we're not only blind about our subject, we're blind about the fact that we're blind. But do you remember that as Christians, we all became Christians by admitting that we were in need, that we were blind? We started by admitting. Do you remember this? I am not perfect. Do you know that once you became a Christian, it did not make you perfect? It did not mean that we get to stop admitting that we're in need. In fact, as Christians, after we become Christians, we continue in need. So we get to continue admitting, I'm a sinner. I'm still in need of grace. I'm still in need of ongoing renewal and ongoing growth in Christ. That's actually what the Bible talks about in 2 Corinthians 3, where it says we're being transformed into the image of Jesus from one degree of glory to another degree of glory to another, from glory to glory. We're not done. None of us is done. We all have a third that we believe that's wrong. And it's not because we're not trying, it's because we're blind. So we have to start with admitting, you know what, I'm blind. And the good news for you and me this morning is that when we do, we're like the blind man in the story we read this morning who receives sight. Instead of being like the religious leaders who think they see, but in fact, because they're so satisfied with their own current vision, they remain blind. They don't get any of the help that Jesus would give them. You and me, we're like the healed man. We get to be like the healed man when we admit, I can't see. Even when he's told that Jesus must be a sinner, he simply replies, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. We get to be able to receive our sight. Church, I want to encourage us to use these remaining weeks of Lent, as we're kind of like, man, Lent is going on and on. Well, now we get to kind of just re-engage and know that in these weeks to come, I want to encourage us to just tell the truth about our blindness. Just tell the truth about it. Because there's healing to be found, even now. Even in these weeks when we're tired and beat up, to just say, you know what, I am in need. I'm blind, I don't even know what I don't see, I need some help. And when we do, we get to receive that healing because it is absolutely, do you hear this? It is absolutely safe to admit our blind spots to Jesus. It's totally safe. It's so beneficial because he heals us. Maybe you want to do that with a trusted friend in a conversation or with a spouse. Maybe you want to do that by setting up a time to have confession with a priest. I'm happy to do that with you if you want. However you do this, however you go about telling the truth about your blindness, the point is this. Let's all come to Jesus and admit our blind spots and receive the healing that God longs to give to each one of us. Amen.